because I love you all and care for you deeply, I went out, I found a copy of SharePoint Designer 2013. I sullied my hands and I installed it on a machine to try to create one so that I could run the PowerShell to test all this stuff. But because SharePoint 2013 doesn't support modern authentication, I couldn't log in to SharePoint Online to create the workflow to test. I'm telling you all, I put hours into this.
Hi, everybody. It's July 23rd, 2025, and today's Ask Some Praxis is SharePoint 2013 workflow and related technology retirement. I believe the gang is all here. And
I'm not here.
So, no, I know, you're never here. Physically, you're here. Mentally, we will have to see. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to start with what is being retired because there's a lot of little fiddly technology bits that are getting retired too, and they're kind of all related to the SharePoint 2013 workflow. So we'll talk about what's being retired. We'll give you the timeline, which we're almost at the end of, so it'll be sort of a retrospective plus when it's all coming crashing down. How do you know if you have these things? And I think that middle question, luckily to be answered by Todd, big game of PowerShell. That's the most important thing. And I think the thing that unfortunately we are missing from Microsoft 365 when they retire things is often we don't have, they're retiring something, but they don't have, or they're not giving you a good way to go find those things. So that's an important piece of this. There's also a Microsoft 365 assessment tool, which is Todd is going to go over a little bit, and that's an external, it's not a Microsoft provided tool, it's a community provided tool, but he'll go over that a little bit. And then Derek and I'll hit on the what you should use instead question. And so let us get started. And all right,
Julie,
Derek, tell us what.
I was going to say, did we want to do a quick just update from last session where?
Oh, sure.
Because
yes.
of the rollback of the templates. Last time we talked about some of the updates. So one of the updates that got rolled back was you can no longer select your heading size in like the quick links or the people web part. So
Right.
We just wanted to just mention it quickly that there were some things that we talked about in the last session of good updates and yay, and they're gone. Hopefully they'll be back soon. That's our goal. That's our wish. But
Thanks for stopping by. Have fun storming the castle.
I just wanted to be sure that we mentioned it. So if people were looking for it, that it is now no longer there.
Yeah, and we'll update our YouTube comments section. We'll add a comment to that, and we'll also add a comment to our Ask Some Praxis page on our website. So yes, good point. Glad you made that. Thank you for interrupting me. All right, back over to Derek. Let's go through what's being retired.
Yes. So as Julie said, sort of in her intro, it's not just SharePoint 2013 workflows. It's actually quite a bit of like little legacy technology bits that they're cleaning up that technical debt. The biggest one, of course, is the 2013 workflows, right? These were workflows that were mainly created in SharePoint Designer. If you were lucky enough to live through the era of SharePoint Designer, you will recognize the little dialogue to the right where you could create new workflows. These things worked in SharePoint 2013. You could also connect them to Project Server if you were using Project Server at the time. The big differentiator between SharePoint 2010 workflows and 2010 and 2013 workflows is that SharePoint 2010 workflows worked against SharePoint directly. They ran inside the context of SharePoint, whereas 2013 workflows worked in that really wonderful workflow management service. That was the proliferation of the services era.
Yes, I think it was.
Yeah, it hurt a lot.
It did.
There were also some very limited REST APIs specifically around workflows. That is all going to start going away. We did a session, I think at this point, a couple of years ago on the 2010 workflows. 2010 workflows are gone. Those have been retired for a really long time. So Julie, if you go to the next slide, we also have retiring SharePoint hosted add-ins and provider hosted add-ins. These were really the precursor to SharePoint Framework. It was our extensibility, our single and only extensibility model to add components to modern. Well, it wasn't actually modern then, to add components to the page. SharePoint hosted add-ins were generally like web parts, right? You would build an image carousel or a list view add-in. Custom provider hosted apps were generally things like spas, single page apps. You could, in theory, host them internally in Azure or in AWS or something like that. Both of these just get pulled in through the wireframe, or through an iframe. The big challenge here is that both of those models are going away. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I only wrote a few of those. That window felt really long, but I don't think they got very much traction because they were really hard to use and create. And I don't think, Julie, you haven't written any.
I was going to say I have never written any because, and so this is a story worth telling. I had my child in 2012, in the fall of 2012, and the 2013 conference for SharePoint 2013 was while I was on maternity leave. And everybody from the organization we worked with, Derek and I were working together at the time, went to that conference. And so when they came back, they were trained up in this new SharePoint add-in model. And about a year into that, we were also working with Bob German at the time, and he looked at me and he said, "This isn't going to last. I think we need to talk about script injection, i.e. script editor and content editor web parts, and making that more of a first party thing."
Those were
absolutely saw the writing on the wall of the SharePoint framework before it ever was the SharePoint framework. And that's when he and I worked up the Widget Wrangler. Great name. Love it still. It was so good. We had a nice little lasso logo. But that was the idea of formalizing that what we now have is a SharePoint framework. It was like a precursor step for it. So yeah, we never did it. The one thing that this had that we have now since lost, or it's been deprecated, is isolation for our web part code, because the URLs were custom URLs, so they were secure. Simply by the fact that the URL of the thing in the iframe had its, it was a host name URL with a GUID. And so it was secure by default because of the domain isolation. So, we had isolated web parts in SharePoint Framework, but they've since been deprecated. So, we've kind of lost that, and we're in this mushy middle ground around it. But yes, so I'll let you continue and finish. But yeah, I never did one.
Yes. So, Julie actually just covered what I was going to say next, which is the domain isolation, but
sorry.
I didn't have a bullet because it didn't fit.
Oh, all right. Well, there you go. So I didn't know you were going to say it because you didn't put it on the slide. Ergo.
You did. All right. And I think this is actually probably just as important. The other thing that is going away is access control services. This was how all of these things connected to SharePoint, how you permissioned the apps and telling them what they could and couldn't do. This is a sample of the screen. You basically had an ID, gave it a title, and then you passed in this entire permissions XML based on what it could do, whether it had full read-write access for a site, or whether it had list access and whatnot. So this is going away as well. And this is important because there are still apps out there, like third-party apps, that are still using this model. And if if you're trying to solve a problem and you search on Google or Bing or whatever, and you look for how to do permissions, sometimes you'll get instructions that will say to do this. So
yeah, so be aware.
Yeah. All right, Julie.
All right. Yep, I'll move on. Okay, so I said we were going to do a timeline slide, and so just to level set, SharePoint 2013 workflows were turned off for newly created tenants back in April of 24. So that had already happened. In November of 24, new tenants couldn't use add-ins anymore or Azure ACS. And so from Derek's sort of description on the previous page, you can see how Azure ACS being retired or deprecated because it was it's a security hole. Essentially, it's not secure enough. So we absolutely are in favor of deprecating it. This is not one of those things where it's like, why are they removing something? There's no reason. This is a good reason. This is a security issue. We absolutely want to deprecate this. But you can see how the Azure ACS having to be deprecated led to add-ins having to be deprecated. They're tightly tied together. So that happened in November of 24. And so the thing we're sort of talking about is at this point, we have less than a year before the April 26th deadline where all of these things are just turned off. So SharePoint 2013 workflows will not work for existing tenants. SharePoint add-ins will stop working for existing tenants. Azure ACS stops working for existing tenants. That happens in April of 26. So in somebody else do math because I can't on the fly in my brain, but in X number of months, 9-ish, give or take, 9-ish months, all those things are going to end and not work. And so if you have them in your tenant, you need to know about it and you need to start thinking about how we can move on. And so on that note, look at me transition. Todd, clear your throat. Here you go. PowerShell away. How do you know?
So the important thing, so if you've got, a big SharePoint tenant and you're, keeping busy doing SharePointy things, now this comes up. Now we've got you worried. You've only got 9-ish months to figure out whether you've got a problem or to deal with. How do you find out whether you have these things or not? So we've kind of got a few different ways to do it, and I've got them like in the maturity model order. One of the things you can do is you can just look. Like you can go to any list or library and you can go to the gear and settings and then more library settings. And then there's probably another settings again, I forget. And then there's a workflow settings tab or link in there. And you can go to that and you can just see which workflows are associated with that list or library. So that will tell you if you have any SharePoint 2013 workflows associated. Obviously that doesn't scale very well, but if you've got some really important lists or libraries, or if you have a small environment and you just don't want to go to the trouble of using any of these other tools, that does work. And there's a screenshot there of what that looks like. There are no workflows in this screenshot. So this site is clear. We have nothing to worry about. So moving up the maturity model a little bit, you can use PowerShell. You get to use PowerShell. And I put a little snippet here that basically just, you get to use PowerShell. That's how I live life.
Awesome.
And so just by getting the list, and then there's a property in there, workflow associations that will tell you what workflows. It's basically the pretty PowerShell version of that ugly page in the corner there. That will tell you what associations you have. Obviously, if you want to spread that out, you would have it loop through the lists in your site, list through the sites in your tenant, that kind of thing. I will say in the spirit of full transparency, I wasn't able to test this because here at Simpraxis, we don't have any SharePoint 2013 workflows in any of our tenants. So I couldn't actually go out, and I tried to make one because I love you all and care for you deeply. I went out, I found a copy of SharePoint Designer 2013. I sullied my hands and I installed it on a machine to try to create one so that I could run the PowerShell to test all this stuff. But because SharePoint 2013 doesn't support modern authentication, I couldn't log in to SharePoint Online to create the workflow to test. I'm telling you all, I put hours into this just because of my love for you.
I should have spun up a VM for you, buddy.
But
I'm sorry.
That's dedication, man. That is dedication.
Yeah, but Julie, I don't think the VM would work because you can't authenticate. I've got a VM with SharePoint 2013 or SharePoint Designer 2013 in it, but I can't authenticate against SharePoint Online because it doesn't understand MFA.
Oh, good point. Because we're trying to verify this against online, not
online.
Yeah. I was thinking, you could log into the SharePoint server. That's not
good. Yep. Yes, Krista, you're absolutely worthy. Every single one of you, I love you all. So what I could have done, I could have created it on-prem, migrated it over, but whatever. But I think from what I've read, that should give you your 2013 workflows. Again, if you run it, loop through your list, loop through your sites. Third-party tools, again, I didn't have any to test on, but I think SysKit will tell you if you have any of these. And I think ShareGate, one of its reports, gives you a workflow report. Mark is nodding his head. I meant to check with him. So if you've already got ShareGate, and you should, gosh darn it, it's a heck of a tool. There's a report there that will tell you where in your tenant those are at. And then finally, the Microsoft 365 assessment tool will tell you that. What's the Microsoft 365 assessment tool, you say? Go to the next page. Well, I'm glad you asked, Mark, It is an open source command line interface tool to help with retirements just like these. So there's the URL. Don't go there right now. Watch the rest of the slide, then go there. But this will not only tell you about the SharePoint 2013 workflows, the things that we're talking about, it will tell you if you have SharePoint add-ins, the thing that Derek was just talking about, Azure ACS, the other thing that Derek was just talking about. And we haven't talked about it yet, but alerts are getting retired. It will tell you about those. It will do everything. It will cook you dinner. It will tuck you in bed at night. This Microsoft 365 assessment tool is the real deal. So you can get it for free. You can download it from that URL, and then you just run it from the CLI. And there's an example there of one that will do the workflow. If you don't, this tool was written for something else, and I forget what its default is. So you have to tell it which mode you want to run it in. So workflow, add-in, that kind of stuff. So this does the workflow. It prompts you for authentication. You put your tenant name in there, and then you have to have an app registration that has permission to do all this. It's all covered in the documentation. Bert did a great job with all that. And then what it does is it exports a report that you can view in Power BI desktop, or it'll give you a CSV file and just show you all the instances of the things you scanned for. So I think I speak for the entire Simpraxis crew when I say this is probably the best way to do it if you don't have ShareGate and you can't just run the tool. This is the way to find these things, and it finds all the other things, the alerts, the ACS, all that jazz.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Todd. The barrier to entry, of course, with this is going to be you need to have that application ID, which is an app registration, and you need your global admin to do that. So if you have a barrier to entry with that, you would need to reach out to your tenant admin and get them on board with the fact that, hey, we've got to find out what all these things are, and let's work together to get this done. Obviously, there's consultants like us or whatever that can also help you do those kinds of tasks. So don't despair.
Those assessment tools, I've used them a couple of times. They take some real focus to do what you want. I mean, they're
working
really
afternoon into it. Yeah.
It's not like you just run an exe and it tells you the answer. It's some setup and some thinking.
And this one, I think the application ID, if you have one for PNP PowerShell, and why wouldn't you? I think that same application ID will have many of the same permissions, so that might work.
I agree with Todd on that. Yeah, you probably can reuse the same application ID. That's a really good tip. But again, I think this, there's a lot of users that people that come to these calls specifically that this would be a little over their head. And so, please understand, we understand that it's over your head, and there are those third-party tools. I mean, I think I would lean into like SysKit or ShareGate for that kind of assessment if you're like, this is a little far beyond me. And want some help with it and or consulting. All right. Derek, back over to you.
All right. Yeah. So I wanted to include this because, and this is very specific to third-party tools. So we're trying to talk about like what should you use when to help mitigate or update this technical debt. And I wanted to start with ACS first because I ran into this with a client. They were using a project management tool, and they weren't necessarily on the most recent version of the tool, but when I was looking at it for them, I was looking at the documentation, and I noticed that it's using ACS. And this is after the notification of the retirement. So of course, I brought that to the attention, but there are still 30 third-party apps out there that are using ACS. You should run the assessments, check to see if they're being used in your tenant, especially if it's something that either, it could be a tool somebody installed years ago and isn't being used anymore, but also if it is currently being used, that's an opportunity for you to reach out to the vendor, right? Check to see if they have a new version. Ask the question, are you using ACS? If you don't know what that means, or you can't speak to that effectively, then this is the time, as Julie said, bring in your admin, because this is a security issue. This is a business continuity issue. So reach out to the vendor, see if there's an update that doesn't use ACS. Now, unfortunately, if there is no option out there, then you need to sort of look at the alternatives for that business, whatever that third-party tool is using. And that could be any of the things that are out there: SharePoint Framework, Logic Apps, Power Automate, or webhooks, or anything like that.
And maybe even out of the box. I didn't say that anywhere, and it just sort of dawned on me. It's like, well, there's a lot of modernization where sometimes things that we wrote custom solutions for are now things we can do it out of the box. Of course, the inverse is also true, which is sad, but
yes.
document sets, anyone?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So you could very well, just be able to recreate what you've got in this third-party app. Right. So just be aware of that, especially with third-party solutions.
For sure. All right. SP workflows.
All right. So as it relates to workflows, I guess the first thing is make sure that you still need the workflow, right? Like, is this business process actually working? If you still have access to SharePoint Designer, you can visualize the workflow. You can sort of see what the different steps are. But from a modernization and migration option, if it is a small one-off workflow, Power Automate is the right choice for that. Azure Logic Apps are a good choice for that. You can use the SharePoint connector inside the Power Platform. One thing that's really important is to know that the SharePoint connector uses the user in the connection. In SharePoint 2010 and 2013 workflows, we could elevate the user permissions and operate as with elevated permissions. The other thing is that these are connected directly to the list and library. With 2013 workflows, we could create one and then use it with multiple libraries. So if you had to change it, you only had to change it in one spot. And then lastly, make sure you build in any kind of error handling or success or failure handling into your app. Each one of those has very limited monitoring. Logic Apps has more than Power Automate, but that's about it. And Julie, you're going to talk about webhooks?
Yeah, I'll hit that one. So this is a talk that I do a lot when I'm out in the wild doing speaking events. I talk about when we want to move on from Power Automate and Logic Apps, and a lot of what Derek covered around the delegated access, around the idea that you can only attach these Power Automate flows or Azure Logic Apps to one list or library at a time becomes very limiting. And so when that limit is hit, you might want to think about a pro code option instead. Now, granted, you need a developer to do that, but webhooks, which is the SharePoint API terminology, or change events, which is the Microsoft Graph terminology and more the industry standard. If you're out about in the wild looking at other SaaS platforms, they will talk about change events. They're a good option when the business log just becomes complex. That's the first one, because we can write pro code in a way that we have much more control over our flow, easier, and reuse of modules of code, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot easier to write complex business process logic. Or when you require that application permission versus user context, i.e. elevated permissions. So wherever you had a workflow where you were using elevated permissions on a list, so the users wasn't going to have the rights that you need, you might want to consider webhooks and change events. The one thing I will say is that depending on how you create them, so this is different depending on Power Automate versus Logic Apps, but I'll use the Logic Apps example. When you create a Logic App and you make the connector to the list, the connector is the person who's creating the Logic App, not the user who triggers the Logic App. And so that is a slightly gray area between the Power Automate flow being run under the user context versus the Power Automate flow running on the creator context. And so I just wanted to be clear that there is sort of two different ways that the permissions can work depending on where you create it and how it's attached to the list. Where webhooks and change events are the application context, because you're running that code in the cloud and you're authenticating, ideally using managed identity. And so you are absolutely then in application context. And or the last and probably the most useful reason is when you need to act on multiple objects with the same or similar logic. So if we have lots of clients where it's like, hey, every project site we create, we want to trigger on the change order list in that project site. And so we want to attach it to the same code over and over again. We don't want to have copies of the code because, of course, when the code needs to change, who the heck wants to go to every instance of that Power Automate flow or that logic app to make the same change over and over again? And there are ways to architect a logic app, so that's not the case, but you'd have to have thought of that, and it's still a little tricky. So just some things to think about in that area. All right, and so then the last one is what should use instead for SharePoint add-ins. So as I said, I sort of skipped the add-in period, and we went straight to client-side code ways of doing these enhancements. So if you are using SharePoint hosted add-ins, then you absolutely just want to be looking at the SharePoint framework. You could also, I suppose, look at Power Apps. That might be an option depending, again, on that authentication and complexity scale. So those are two options. It's not written down here, but we should have written Power Apps there. For provider hosted, I think you should more be thinking about something like the Microsoft 365 Agents Toolkit, formerly known as the Teams Toolkit. And in this case, probably the better name to use, because Agents Toolkit implies it's going to have something to do with Copilot. It's definitely a marketing renaming for that toolkit, because the idea with the toolkit in general is that you are creating applications that you're hosting, and you're deriving a manifest that tells Microsoft 365 where your code is and how to run it. And so it's iframing it into the various places where you can plug it in, and there are many. So I won't go into too much detail there. Provider hosted could also sort of be the SharePoint framework, and I say that because you could build code libraries that you host that do the full functionality of whatever functionality you're trying to bootstrap in, and then only use the SharePoint framework to bootstrap that library in to get it in the UI, and not actually host the solution in the provider, i.e. SharePoint. And then, of course, event receivers, if you used any event receivers in the add-in model, Power Automate we've already talked about, or that SharePoint webhooks and graph change events. So those are all options for that. All right. We have some resources for you so that you can click on those if you need to, or we'll have those links in the show notes. And then finally, good timing us. We are going to do classic publishing site creation retirement. So that's the next retirement announcement that just came out. They are deprecating or retiring, classic publishing site creation. So that's an important one. We'll go into that on August 6th. In the meantime, I will be at TechCon 365 in Atlanta. That's August 11th through 15th. And then I will also be with Mark at Experts Live in New York City. That's October 10th. And then right following that, Collab Days New England will be on October 17th. And both Patrick and Todd will be presenting there, which is fun. And then myself and Mark will be at TechCon 365 in Dallas in November. That's the 3rd through 7th. So lots of places to see us live. Feel free to join us. We will get more discount codes as they come, but we have one for Atlanta. Let us know if you want one for Dallas before we get it out on one of these shows, and we will get that for you. The other two, well, New York Experts Live New York City is $15, and Collab Days New England is free. So definitely come join us if you can be in those areas. Otherwise, that is all we have for today, and we certainly appreciate everybody joining us. Thank you again, and we will see you all on August 6th.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Some Praxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.